Sanibonani Dumelang, good evening and welcome to episode 250 of the Private Property Podcast. I'm your host, Uzamantungwa Kumalo. If you're joining us for the first time, well, you have been missing out on great property content right here across our social media pages on private property. So do make sure that you go to our Facebook or our YouTube page to catch up on all the great content that you have already missed out on. And to all our regular viewers, welcome to it. You know how we do it every single weekday at 7 p.m. You and I always have an appointment where I always speak to an expert who helps us better navigate our property journey. And we're going to be doing just that this evening. I think one of the big things, I was thinking of earlier is that we've now reached episode 250, and it's quite a big milestone. I think when we started the podcast, and many of you, of course, who are regular viewers, have heard this particular story, that it really started off as a podcast that was, for lockdown. We thought we were going to be in lockdown for 21 days, and we had planned 6 episodes for a Saturday and a Sunday, so all those weekends during lockdown. And now here we are, 250 episodes later, and we come to your screens every single weekday. And of course, we know that we wouldn't have been able to do this without you at home. So thank you for always tuning in, for always engaging, and of course, sharing with your friends and family the live as we always go on. We do encourage you to keep on doing that because we want to make the property circle bigger. And that's one of the things that I'm certainly quite a huge advocate for. And it doesn't matter where in the property value chain you are or where in your property journey you are. Perhaps you're still a tenant, perhaps you're still living at home, you're looking to buy, to sell, to build, or to even build, amarum ekaya or extend into ekaya. It really doesn't matter where you still are in your property journey. This is the property show that you want to make sure you are always tuned into. And as I live property myself, I was saying to my colleague of air that I'm in a room that's very empty. That's why you can hear my sound is a bit hollow. That's because I'm also managing my own properties and making sure that the property is ready for tenants to move in tomorrow. And there wasn't enough time to move because it's raining in Johannesburg, quite badly. And I go, you know what? If I get into the car and try to make it back home, I know I'm going to be stuck in traffic. So let's just set up for the show right here, because this is what happens when you're a property investor, right? You end up having to take on virtual meetings and of course go live on the show in one of your properties because that is just what it calls for. Well, we are ready to get into this evening's conversation. We were meant to have these 2 gentlemen a few weeks ago, but we had to move it up, and I did promise you that we're definitely going to have them back because this is a topic that so many of you have been asking for, and I did promise that we're going to have them back, and I know that we're probably going to invite them again in the future. We're talking tax and property and understanding asset protection. I think the big point there is you're probably wondering, what exactly do we mean by asset protection? Well, we're going to be looking at that and also getting an understanding of the different facets of asset protection. And another thing that we're also going to be exploring, because we talk about this quite a lot here on the show, around buying a particular property in a different entity other than in your personal capacity. We're going to be looking at the risks that are associated with buying into a company. Those are some of the issues that you can look forward to this evening. And the 2 gentlemen that I am in conversation with are, of course, Bruno Simao, who needs no introduction, attorney extraordinaire, as well as Shillyboy Mothiba, who's, of course, an accountant and has been helping us with all things tax and accounting when it comes to our property and our property portfolio. Gentlemen, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, Zam. It's such a pleasure. Thank you.
Hi, Zama. Good evening, and good evening to everyone who's watching. Thank you for having us again.
It's such a pleasure to have both of you this evening. And I think, let's get into it because I know the last time we were together, we ran out of time. I can already anticipate that this evening we're going to run out of time again. So I want us to get through as much as we possibly can. And to, of course, our viewers at home, if you have any questions around asset protection and how you can best protect your property portfolio, especially when it comes to not just protecting the portfolio itself, but when it also comes to tax matters. Because I think one of the big pressure points as a property investor is, of course, the tax implications of the income that you would derive from your various properties. So if you're still not quite sure how to best maximize that particular asset, do send us a question down here below. And if you've reached that sweet spot and you know how to go about it, also let me know. We, of course, want to hear from you and learn from how you have already successfully done it. I'm going to start with you, Bruno. I mean, what exactly do we even mean when we talk about asset protection, particularly when it comes to property?
Sure. So asset protection applies across the board, not just property. So it's generally all the assets that a person has. And typically when we look at assets, we think of as things or property that generate some form of income, right? So we need to protect these because this is what we rely on to make money. So for example, shares in a business or a business in itself, that would land up being an asset in a person's estate. And it does require some level of attention and some level of protection. So that's what we're looking now at asset protection. Now, what's interesting is there are connotations of asset protection being something untoward. You're hiding things away. It's not about hiding things away. It's about properly structuring so that you're running businesses the right way. These structures are there for a reason, and there are rules. There are exceptions to those rules, and no one's saying that you need to break these rules in order to protect your assets. You need to abide by these. And what I typically tend to find is that you have these two extremes of the people that lie their way out of it, and they go completely extreme to the point where the courts cannot withhold this type of protection that they're trying to give to their assets. And then we've got the other extreme of the people that unfortunately didn't get the right type of education or information right at the beginning of their journey, their property investment journey or their business or whatever the case is. And in those instances, they go in buying things in their personal name, for example, and completely exposing their businesses by virtue of doing that. And the nice thing with asset protection is it's also not just a corporate thing. It's not about just companies and trusts. I mean, it goes all the way down to the root of how are you married? What is the relationship between yourself and your spouse? The legal relationship, how does that work? Are you exposing your assets there? How does your estate look like and your estate planning? That's where Shillyboy comes in, even from a tax perspective, because it's not very well protected if SARS can get their hands on it either. How is your family going to deal with your assets once you pass away? That also speaks of protection, because it's going somewhere you don't typically or necessarily want it to go. And that is like the broad spectrum of asset protection in this bigger picture of structuring that we speak about.
And Shillyboy, I mean, I want to get your take on, especially when we then, as Bruno also pointed out, that you typically be coming in when it comes to estate planning and ensuring that people have a really good grasp of how to best plan their estate in its entirety and ensure that it is best protected. Because I think this is also one of those things, and I admit this all the time on the show, that every time I've had to, sit down with a financial advisor and have that conversation, I remember the first time it was very daunting, it was very intimidating, and there's so many things. And there was a part of me that thought, look, I'm in my 20s, there's really no need for me to stress about this, even though in my 20s I already had assets that ultimately needed to be protected. But there was this thing of, you know what, nothing's going to happen to me now. Maybe when I'm in my 30s, I'm now in my 30s, and there's still a part of me that thinks, maybe not. But of course, I know better, and know that we need to, look at estate planning and making those tough decisions. So when we talk even about making some of those tough decisions, Shillyboy, what should we bear in mind when it comes to estate planning, particularly when it comes to ensuring that our assets are as protected as possible?
Thank you, Zama. And I think maybe we also need to take a step back and just reflect on what do we mean by saying asset protection, because we might end up actually not even being more specific, that we're using these terminologies that end up overwhelming people. Fundamentally, on a form, is that what we mean by asset protection, we're basically saying that you've created wealth, you worked hard, you're now working hard, Zama, you're trying to getting your properties ready for tomorrow for a tenant. You're creating wealth. But then once you create wealth, the question is, how do you then preserve it? How do you then keep it? Basically, when you say asset protection is, how best do I keep this wealth? And what are the variables that I need to worry about preserving this wealth? And you keep wealth for various reasons. It might be because you've got legacy, you've got charities, you want to give back, you've got kids that you want to transfer wealth. So we all have fundamentally different reasons, right? Now, when you're going to look at onto variables that typically lead to people not protecting their wealth, like Bruno said, and estate planning, taxes is one of them. But what do we mean by that? So now it's an issue of poor record keeping, non-compliance with tax legislations, having assets in your personal. You mentioned that you're in your 20s. You didn't think, why should I be worried about being overwhelmed by all these technicalities? But I'll put it to you this way. Should, God forbid, something happens to you, you leave us tomorrow, which I'm not wishing that, but what will happen? Then potentially you've got this huge bill if you have been building this property portfolio in your personal name, because you'll be subject to estate duty, provided all the calculations met, and then you'll be subject to an estate duty. Already you're triggering capital gain tax by virtue of you passing away, which means is a deemed disposal, then you'll be subject to capital gain tax. So if you look at that, it means you did not plan your wealth in a more efficient way, right? Which means that should you have listened maybe to Bruno and say, what would be my best way of actually preserving and keeping this wealth to the next generation, or for whatever reason that you want to keep this wealth for, then you would have actually planned and had your overall estate planning in such a way that should such a variable happens, then that wouldn't happen. I mean, Bruno will speak about issues of marriage. What happens if you're married in communal property and your partner is incapacitated, right? You might take that as another variable that can end up making you lose your wealth by virtue of not having structured your things to think of many variables. So I think the starting point is also about individual thinking, sitting down with the likes of Bruno to say, given all these variables that are out there, how best should I be preserving this wealth that I'm creating, which leads you to asset protection. So I think later on, we're gonna speak a lot about the estate planning. What are the tax implications of these guys who create wealth in their personal names? I mean, for that matter, if you've got a couple of properties in your personal name and you're already sitting at marginal high tax rate of 40%, which means effectively that the income that you're generating from the rental, Azama, meaning that it's going to be taxed at that 40%, well compared to simply if you had put that in a company which you could have paid 28%. Effectively, 40 minus 28%, which is 12%. You're effectively not what? Preserving wealth. You're effectively not what? Doing asset protection, because the income, effectively, it's your asset if it's converted into some sort of investment.
Mm-hmm. I'm this evening in conversation with Shillyboy, Mothiba, as well as Bruno Simao. We look at asset protection as well as tax and property, and of course, better understanding the various ways that we can preserve our assets, as Shillyboy has so nicely put it. And I want to hear from you at home if you've walked down this path, because this is one of those things that you do more than once. And I always confess about some of the mistakes that I've made, but also the things that give me a lot of anxiety as a millennial. And one of them is around estate planning. And you know what? It's very admin intensive, very angst inducing, but it's one of those things that we do need to do. And when I do eventually do it, I'm always like, oh my God, I'm actually an adult. I can't believe how much of an adult I am. And I mean, imagine doing that in your early 20s and having to sit down with financial advisors and do the whole exercise. It's very intimidating because certainly at that age, I mean, it was nearly a decade ago, there was so much I just didn't understand. So almost fast forward nearly a decade later, and I certainly have a better grasp of what the lay of the land is, even across different asset classes and not just one asset classes. And the reality of having to continuously do the work, and continuously, look at where your portfolio, and when I say portfolio, I mean your portfolio holistically, not just your property portfolio, but, your full portfolio, and where some of the potential gaps are, how you can best grow it, and as Shillyboy has highlighted it, how you can constantly keep preserving it, because we're not going to be working this hard and essentially, have our money go down the drain because we're not putting in the hours to make sure that we protect it as best as possible. So then, Bruno, what are then the three facets of asset protection for viewers at home? Because now they're probably thinking, understand what asset protection, entails. So what are some of the facets then of asset protection for viewers at home?
All right, thanks so much. So the reason why we break it down into these smaller components, that people actually understand the true meaning of this conversation. So you recall from our last chat, we had the three components of structuring effectively. I don't know why it's always in threes, but it looks like that's the lucky number.
It's consultants. The consultants got it into us, and so now it's stuck with us.
Absolutely. So when we looked at structuring and we looked at the best way to invest in your investment vehicles, we spoke about asset protection, tax efficiency, and financing optimization. So these are the three principles. So now under asset protection, it's one of these principles that you need to balance in your bigger investment journey. So we're looking now at asset protection, and we're trying to break it down to say, well, what does it actually entail? I mean, what does this mean for people? Do they even need it? Because if they can say no to all three of these, then maybe asset protection isn't something to focus on, although doubtful, but it is something to consider. So I've broken it down into three very simplistic views on how to deal with it. So first of all, you want to protect your business from yourself. Right? This is a very common one. It's the most common one. So you want to have your property, for example, or you want to have your business. Now, the last thing you want is you in your personal capacity in any way to cause some issue in your business that causes it to be exposed. So, for instance, if you do something like land up in a fight at a bar or a car accident and you need to repair somebody's car and you're not insured. Even things like divorces, when you're in a divorce, like a divorce fight or a divorce battle, and now this somehow impacts your businesses are now brought into this battle and they form part of it. These are things that you try and avoid. All these things that happen in your personal capacity have to happen in your personal capacity. You can't get married in a company. So there's no way you can protect that and isolate or ring fence that. So what do? You ring fence your business interests. And we do this by running businesses in separate vehicles and keeping it away from our personal life. Now, by the same token, you want to protect yourself from your business. So not all businesses are risk-free. Not all businesses are glamorous and lovely, and the only thing that could ever impact them is you. It's the other way around also. Some of your businesses carry risk. So you'd want to make sure that in this risky business where, for example, you undertake a massive development and now there's a whole bunch of debtors' debt and there's risk going around, and now you have these creditors that you need to pay. You want to be able to pull yourself away and go, I'm trading under this business. This business undertakes a liability. I'm not being reckless. This is totally lawful. I'm running the business in the right way and I'm keeping it away from myself. If anything happens to this business, I will still be safe. And that's basically protecting yourself from your business. And the last one to consider is protecting your businesses from each other. So it's great that you're separating yourself from your business, but the one thing people seldom think about is what if your businesses cause issues with each other? You want to make sure that your property investment in inner city buildings is kept separate from your developments, that's kept separate from your multi-lets, or maybe a student accommodation in a nice area, or maybe just your suburban single let in a nice. You want to be able to gauge the risk and go, well, I don't want them in the same place, because if one thing goes wrong with this one, what happens to this one? It's going to be entirely exposed. So that's the three components of your risk management that fall within asset protection. And typically from here is where we start having the conversation on how do you structure, what vehicle. So before we worry about, is it a company, is it a trust, we're first going to look at this and say, how do you answer the three of these? And once you've got your answers and you understand these, we can then look at what vehicles in order to make sure that you're well protected in all three, or give some more protection in one than the other.
And, you know, Bruno, I actually love that distinction, because more often than not, especially when we're starting off, we don't think about, and this is starting off not just even in property, but certainly even as entrepreneurs or young entrepreneurs, you don't think of the risk factor that your business potentially poses, or the risk that you pose to your business, the risk that your business poses to you. And sometimes when you're very enterprising, you know, you start off in maybe different businesses, or you end up running, I'll say, multiple types of businesses, but really it's under one entity. So the sort of service offering that you communicate is relatively different. But when you look at the paperwork, you're operating from, you know, one registration number, one bank account, and not having a clear understanding of the liability that potentially potentially poses. Because if somebody is dealing with you, as you're saying, and property is a good example. On the one hand, you could be letting out, on another, you could be developing, and you're running it under one umbrella. Perhaps you're using slightly different names just for branding purposes. And the next thing you know, the development, you know, goes incredibly bad. Whereas, you know, the letting side goes incredibly well, but because you haven't adequately separated these, you know, the liability from essentially this arm of the business ultimately cripples what could have been, you know, a really successful business holistically, especially if you had just separated things and almost had different businesses that are separate from each other, and you're the director, perhaps you have different partners if that was the setup, but you know that those are nicely separated. I'm going to take a few questions and comments from our viewers at home. I saw one that's come in, and it speaks quite directly to where we're going in our conversation, and it's coming from one of our top fans on Facebook, Martha Shinange, who's asking, can the Power Tag team please share what the pros and cons of moving a property from my personal portfolio into a company? I know we're going to be looking at, making sure that you buy into a different vehicle, and looking particularly at a company, because I know more often than not people would use a company than a trust. So let's look at the pros and cons of moving. Let's start with the pros, because I think those are probably outweigh the rest. So what are the pros of moving your portfolio from your personal capacity into a company?
Okay. Yeah. You want to go on?
I think Shillyboy, I'll give it to you first, and then Bruno will come in.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks, guys. I think let me maybe look at from a tax point of view. I mean, to start with, you might be high-end, one of the privileged one, earning higher income. Already, like I said earlier on, you are high marginal tax rate. So effectively, if you are generating rental income in your personal name, you'll be taxed at that higher marginal tax rate. So that's number one. Just by virtue of you moving that, you're pretty much saving that. The second part will be, like I said earlier on, the issue of an estate duty. When you've got properties in your personal name, the day it comes, which is death, is inevitable. So such asset portfolio will constitute what we call diseased estates, and then will be subjected to estate duty, provided that obviously you follow those provisions within. So there's potential estate duty, right? It's about 20%. We're looking at about 20% on dutiable amount, anything below 30 million, and 25% above 30 million. We're talking about big numbers here. And for property investor, for that matter, the chances of you being a multi-millionaire, you already know, I mean, you just need a couple of properties, you're already a multi-millionaire, which means potentially your diseased estate is higher. So you're looking at that. You're also looking at issues of capital gain tax, because when you die, the tax provision basically says that you effectively have deemed to have sold your properties, which you will potentially be subjected to capital gain tax. And effectively, if you're already at the higher tax rate, you're looking at about effectively 18% of your wealth gone, of your capital gain. So we are talking about big numbers here for a property investor, just by virtue of you having those properties in your personal name. And I think another thing which is more finance rather than tax is that when you move your properties actually from your personal name, you're actually releasing that affordability in your personal name, because we all know that once you actually take that bond in your personal name, you're most likely going to reach a borrowing capacity. And then by virtue of you actually releasing that out of your personal name, then you are freeing yourself to actually more further investment. You can say, I think that's the first point of leverage, where you just need to realize that equity. You might be realizing the equity because you find that you have been paying this bond, you've been diligent, and then you've got an equity in that property. Then by virtue of you actually moving that property into an investment structure, you can actually release that equity. I think there are two pros there. It's about equity releasing, which you will make a lot of money. And then there's also issue of affordability that you cannot release from there. So those on a high level, that's what I can think of, on the top of my head, to say, by virtue of you guys moving that, you pretty much, I think that the maybe, I don't know, you want to focus on the advantages first, and then we can look at the disadvantages.
Yes, I think let's get the advantages out of the way. So there's tax, there's equity, and also affordability. Bruno, any addition in terms of the upside of moving from your personal capacity to a business, rather, a company?
Sure. So as a basic example, and I mean, I think this says it all. If you own two properties in your personal name, right, they're half paid up. So maybe it's not a full bond, it's half a bond, it's still outstanding. Now, anything happens at all to the one property. So let's say the one is forming part of a development, and you get sued. This is the example that we spoke about like a few minutes ago. You get sued in this development. What's going to happen? Now, the second property is going to be exposed, because they're going to sue on this first property, the contract regarding this first property. Now, we don't know what the amounts are. We don't know if the property value would even cover the debt. So now the worry is that the second property is going to sit exposed, and they're going to be able to access it, sell it, and also use those proceeds to recover the debt, right? So that's personal capacity in a nutshell. There's many variations of how things like this can go down. So now we start looking at a step up, and we go, okay, hold on, wait. We need to separate, and we need to put one of our businesses here, one of our businesses here. So we're going to run it in a company, because now, and this is my typical example when it comes to asset protection, is imagine a bucket that's full of water, right? But it's one bucket and it's full of water, and people can go there with cups and they can start taking out the water, and that's the exposure. That's basically the analogy on exposure. So what are you trying to do with asset protection? You're trying to put other buckets around your main bucket, and you're trying to empty the cups into those little buckets. And effectively, by doing that, you're creating diversity. You're spreading your risk so that each bucket has just a little bit of water. So enough to keep a business going, but not enough to fill one person to get absolutely everything back. So we're trying to now separate these buckets. The problem now, moving away from the analogy, is by simply having a company or two companies, and this comes to the risk of trading in a company, is you in your personal capacity are still going to be a shareholder. So what people don't realize is this isn't really spreading your risk and moving it into another company, because one of those facets of asset protection that I spoke about earlier is not being ticked. And that's the fact that if something happens to you, your shares that are being held in your personal name are still exposed. So for all intents and purposes, if this company is sitting with an asset of R1 million, those shares are worth R1 million. Those shares are in your personal name. Therefore, you're exposing R1 million worth of assets. And Shillyboy can attest to this. This also touches your estate duty, because you haven't moved it away from your personal estate. So whether the property is in your own name and worth R1 million, or whether the shares are in your name worth R1 million, is inconsequential to SARS, because they're going to see R1 million and going to want to charge you for it. So this is now where we start looking at, well, how do we properly put these buckets in a way that they're almost completely separate from each other? And this is where we typically use the trust structure. Now, it's a funny structure, and we could have like an entire episode just on a trust.
We're going to have a very separate, episode around trust, because we get this question all the time, and we often get it when we are having a conversation about something slightly different. So we're typically not focusing primarily on trusts, and so we're definitely going to focus on trust, because it is one of those topics that you need almost a whole hour to cover. I think 15 minutes isn't sufficient. I want to squeeze in this question because I'm also aware that we are going to be running out of time. And this is a question from our Mudisa King on Facebook saying, are all these taxes applicable even if a will is in place allocating the property to my kids? Should the property be in my name in the event that I die?
Shillyboy, do you want to take that one?
No, I think there the will be. If, let's say, for instance, he stipulated in his will that should I die, these assets is going to so and so person X, my child, right? The fact of the matter is that before it can actually be transferred to your child, which is a heir or lekete, it needs to be subjected to part of deceased estates. And you need to follow the whole process of going to the Master of the High Court and what we call winding up of deceased estates. So that's that process. But before you do that, they also pass at SARS where we need to pay those. If there's any applicable estate duty, then SARS is going to say, hey, Mr. So-and-so, before we can actually transfer these to so-and-so, we need to pay certain applicable taxes and other fees. So that's why you find certain deceased estates where the children are even actually forced now to sell their properties because the estate is not what we call liquid. And then as a result, they have to dispose these assets, and then you end up having to pay SARS and other applicable fees. So to answer that person's question, yes, those taxes will be applicable as long as that property at the date of your death is in your personal name. The only thing that he is doing is just moving the assets now to the children's name, which he still continue with the case. So I wouldn't encourage him even also doing that. I would rather say, should I die if my child is a minor? Because he is also creating another issue here. If he dies and then he has a minor children, which means those children cannot actually even inherit those because they are minor. So what will happen? That assets will end up going into the guardianship fund. We don't want that. So normally what we'll then do from estate planning point of view, and it's going to come during the trust side of things. Then what you then do, you rather than say, this should actually register it under the trust, which is what we call testamentary trust, instead of just leaving it and continue with the case that you have actually created yourself. So that's pretty much where he is, I think that's a solution for him.
Bruno, I want to bring you in with Martha's question because we actually only answered one half of her question. She had asked for the pros and the cons, and we've essentially looked, I'll say, at the pros of potentially moving from your personal capacity to a business. So what's the downside of it? Because we've painted a very gloomy picture, as it were, and I want us to look at the downside for people who are looking at being property investors. So you're not just looking at, for example, your primary residence. We all know for the most part your primary residence is, of course, going to be in your personal capacity. So people who are looking at actively buying multiple properties for investment purposes, what would then be the downside of moving a property from your personal capacity into a company?
Look, so the reality is there's very little downside if done correctly. And I think that's what the emphasis needs to be, right? There can be great downside if the advice that you're receiving is very cookie cutter and you're trying to utilize certain principles that don't necessarily apply to you, right? So, with a brief breakdown, I mean, from a tax perspective, there could be a downside. It very well could be if you have a very low interest rate and you own the property now in a company, you know what, maybe there could be a little bit more tax that's applicable. If you move it to a trust, for example, and you want to retain the money in the trust, from a tax perspective, that's not great either. And Shillyboy we can speak about this forever. So from a tax perspective, depends how you plan it. There are good ways of doing it. So if we see that a person has a high tax rate, there's a certain way of structuring it. So you can make it an upside. There's no downside unless you do it incorrectly. From an asset protection perspective, I can honestly say that the only downside is overconfidence, right? A lot of people, a lot of property investors get confident, arrogant is a very strong word, but you understand the kind of sentiment that I'm explaining is, and again, this goes to the alter ego, again, a conversation around trust. If you go and you start treating this trust as though it's you, and so it's simply an alter ego, and you using it simply to hide your assets, and it's apparent. You don't have proper records. You barely have a separate account. You move money between accounts like there's no difference. You're going to get into trouble. And then you cannot be surprised later when a court rules that this is your alter ego and for all intents and purposes is your money or these are your assets. You can't be surprised because you've been treating it like it's your assets. So downside, if you do it incorrectly, there's going to be a lot of downsides. If you do it correctly, asset protection, you're good. Tax efficiency, you're good. Financing optimization, you're good. There are no downsides if done correctly. I can honestly say, possibly now there's an admin cost. So there's a cost of administering a trust. So that might be a downside.
Yeah, I want to squeeze this question in, and I'm asking Biola not to kill me because I know that we've run out of our time. And I already said that I know we're not going to have enough time for 30 minutes. I almost need to do a special episode for an hour where we go through this, because tax and property is one of those conversations that's always going to require slightly more than 30 minutes. I'm going to squeeze in this first a comment, but I want the question from Litemba. The comment is, investors, they always want accounting statements of a business and SARS claimants, etc. So that's a comment from Uspami on Facebook. But then the question is actually from Ulitemba Benenge on Facebook, asking, please comment on the advantage of keeping an investment property in your personal name to take advantage of turnover tax, as there's a 20% limit for income investment for registered companies. However, that limit does not exist for sole traders. This tax advantage is often left out when deciding which vehicle to house your investment investment properties. Shillyboy, can I give that one to you?
Look, I think this person normally they're referring to the small business taxes, where if you, let's say you don't have multiple businesses, then the way it gets taxed, it gives that it assumes as if, I'm just using the layman English here, so it's as if this is an individual, so there's like a preferential way of taxing as compared to, but effectively you're going to be taxed at the normal as a company, but then it's more like a scaling tax method, right? Which is easier. But then one of the requirements there is that you shouldn't be a director of multiple companies for that matter. That's why even that person is not applicable to the sole traders for that, because you need to have that one company. And in CIPC, for that matter, you must only be like one company at all. But knowing property investors, you will register one company here, and then tomorrow you are partner with Zama, you register another company, then you are not going to be entitled to that turnover-based tax.
Okay. Well, gentlemen, we have run out of our time. I know that I've eaten into my colleagues' time as they're about to get on their show. I want us to wrap up. Any final tips? And I'm already promising you at home, we're going to continue having very regular conversations about, taxes when it comes to our property investments. We've got a comment from Abake Mudisake saying we will need to discuss the best vehicle to house properties if the intention is to create wealth for generations to come, whether we look at a company or a trust. And sorry to mispronounce you, I can promise you we're going to look at that. As we already said, we want to explore trusts quite significantly, because it is one of those topics that we haven't explored a lot on the podcast. So we're going to invite the gentlemen back, both of them, so that we can best look at this. Bruno, Shillyboy, any final tips for viewers at home when it comes to asset protection, particularly when it comes to their properties? I know that we know that asset protection is your assets in its entirety, but our viewers are quite keen, of course, on property. What is the one thing that, if you almost didn't understand anything from this conversation, but you want to make sure that you preserve wealth as much as possible, what's the one thing that should always be top of mind as you start even doing your research and gaining better knowledge on asset protection? I'll start with you, Bruno.
Sure. So maybe this is actually a nice comment, or a warning rather. What I found, especially from my litigation background and the court's approach to investors and structuring and the like, is if a person leaves things very late and identifies a problem. So for example, typically in divorces, you find a lot of cases where this happens in divorces, but it happens with creditors as well. And all of a sudden, they start trying to move assets around, desperately trying to protect it. It's too late. It's too little, too late. And it's one of those things where, done right from the beginning, it's less expensive. There's actually ways of making it less expensive. And you'll realize this just by some of the cost savings that are very easily pointed out. So don't procrastinate because you feel that it's going to be too expensive, you can't afford it. There's inexpensive ways of doing it. And it's going to be more expensive if you leave it for later. Because trying to move assets across later, it costs money. Trying to hide assets later is probably going to mean nothing. Because the courts simply won't accept it.
They will find those assets. They will find those assets. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Shillyboy, from your side?
And I think I echo what Bruno is saying, that you should try to avoid to do things at the last minute. And that comes with making sure that you take on the responsibility or ensuring that there's a tax compliance. You need to know, it's your responsibility to know that at what point do I need to submit professional tax returns? At what point do I need to submit annual tax returns? What taxes am I responsible for as I'm creating this wealth? Because, I mean, from the old saying that it takes 3 generations to lose wealth. But in order to avoid such a stigma, it means it starts with you taking care and being responsible in paying taxes and making sure that you comply. And for that matter, I don't expect you to be an expert, but rather engage people who are in that field and make it their responsibility to ensure that you've got a tax-efficient compliance. And trust me, SARS will be your friend if you do things the right way. And you can actually, the moment you end up, we always even say that the moment you start making tax laws your friend, you're actually going to see how in your corner they are, instead of the myth that actually SARS is out there to take money away from you. It's actually friendly. You can actually make a lot of money just being a friend with SARS.
Well, you know that only an accountant will say that SARS can be your friend. Well, Shillyboy, Bruno, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It has been a pleasure to have both of you. And I'm promising the viewers at home, we're going to have the gentlemen back, particularly on this topic, because understanding our taxes when it comes to property portfolios are the various ways that we can look at structuring, whether we're looking at using a company as a vehicle, or of course a trust as a vehicle. We're going to have them back as we take a deep dive into understanding trusts, because I know that that is a topic that so many of you have been asking us to have and continue wanting us to have. So we're definitely going to have them back on this one. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us, and have yourselves a great evening.
Thank you so much, Zama.
Thank you, Zama.
And that is Shillyboy, Mothiba, as well as Bruno Simao this evening as we wrap up the Friday edition of the Private Property Podcast with myself, Khumalo. It has been a pleasure to be with you this evening. It is a Friday, so Chad will be bringing you the Home Shoppers Show at 8 p.m. I'm back on your screens on Monday evening at 7 p.m. Until then, hoping you're going to stay home, stay safe, and have a great weekend.